Fintan O'Toole joins us to talk about his new book, which tells the history of modern Ireland in parallel with the author's own life.
Irish people for generations, had been voting with their feet and saying, actually, we want to be modern. We'd rather live in New York than, on a small hill farm in County Mayo.
Julie Otsuka will tell us about her new novel, The Swimmers, which starts with a large group at a pool and then turns into the powerful story of a particular mother and daughter.
I really saw the pool as being a stand-in for the world. It's a kind of a meta place that seemed to encapsulate quite nicely just a world that we could live in.
Alexandra Alder joins us with news from the publishing industry. Plus, my colleagues will be here to talk to me about what they've been reading. This is the Book Review Podcast. It's March 25th. I'm John Williams. Fintan O'Toole joins us now. He's the author of many books, the most recent of which is We Don't Know Ourselves, A Personal History of Modern Ireland. In the New York Times Book Review column, McCann says that the book is not a memoir, nor is it an absolute history, nor is it entirely a personal reflection or a credo. It is, in fact, all of these things helix together. His life, his country, his thoughts, his misgivings, his anger, his pride, his doubt, all of them belonging eventually to us. Fintan, thanks for being here.
It's a real pleasure, John. Thank you.
So your book has an interesting framing device, which is your own life. You were born in 1958, and your book takes us from that point in time up until the current day in Ireland. And it's essentially a history of modern Ireland with biographical elements weaved into it. Let's start with your life. You were born in 1958. Take us to the texture of your childhood, where you were, what your parents were like, and what it was like growing up there in your early years.
Yeah, so I was born in a working class public housing project in Dublin in 1958. My father worked as a bus conductor, which kind of now sounds like a Cooper or a Thatcher or one of those jobs that's just disappeared. But, he basically collected the fares on the Dublin bus system. My mother, well, she had worked in a cigarette factory, and then she was a homemaker. And then later on, she worked as an office cleaner. And we were a Catholic family, as almost everybody that I knew were Catholic. This Ireland was overwhelmingly Catholic. it was well over 95% Catholic. And not just in theory, but in practice, that was very much people who, went to Mass every Sunday at least, and, confessed their sins to the priest and tried to behave as good Catholics and obey what the clergy told them. And so my background was very much within that kind of world. But it was also a world that was declining in the simplest sense, which was just people were leaving. There were two countries in Europe that lost population in the 1950s. 1950s was the great period of the Marshall Plan, the rebuilding of Europe after the Second World War and the Holocaust and all that. But there were two countries that were not succeeding. And one was East Germany, losing population, and the other was Ireland. People were leaving in very large numbers. And, there was that sense that something had to give, or otherwise there might not be anybody left on the island by the year 2000.
There are some rather shocking statistics in the book. You call it at one point a relentless demographic disaster. You write that 3 out of 5 children growing up in Ireland in the 1950s would leave at some point. And over the course of 120 years, stopping in 1961, the population had gone from 6.5 million to 2.8 million. What was behind this mass exodus? I think when people hear East Germany was struggling after the war, that makes sense. But tell us specifically what was happening in Ireland.
So there was this sort of long-term force, really, of relative poverty, at a simple level. This started in the most dramatic way, I suppose, in the 1840s and subsequently with the Great Famine. There were 8.5 million people on the island in 1840. Even now we've only got 6.5 million. We're back to 6.5 million. So that demographic disaster was rooted in that catastrophe of the famine. But also over time, it meant that you had Irish communities, of course, in New York, in Boston, in Chicago, but also in London, in Birmingham, in Glasgow, in Australia and Canada. And the pull was really quite strong, and the pull was quite simply, Irish people didn't want to be exotic. They didn't want to be, romantically poor. They didn't want to be seen as holier because they were more ascetic and didn't hunger after the sins of the flesh. We wanted the flesh, we wanted modernity, and this was the paradox really of the place I grew up in, that it had this image of itself as being somehow kind of standing out against the modern world. But Irish people for generations, I mean, had been voting with their feet and saying, actually, we want to be modern. We'd rather live in New York than, on a small hill farm in County Mayo. And that was a very, very powerful impulse. There was also a less obvious one, I think, but certainly by the 1950s, by the time I was born, there was a real frustration. There was a sense that actually, living in a holy Catholic Ireland wasn't really such a paradise. The repression of sexuality, the repression of women. One of the things that's very interesting about Irish migration, I don't know of any other country whose migration was majority female. Typically, migrants tended to be, the young man would go over from the village and establish himself and then come back to the village and marry, and then they'd all go back to America. But, huge numbers of Irish women, young Irish women, for generations sort of left on their own. And they left because obviously they wanted more opportunities, but they also didn't want to be subjected to being the standard bearers of some sort of Irish exceptionalism in terms of being holy and being the embodiment of some sort of sense of Irish exceptionalism.
Yeah, and these incredibly old-fashioned values. Then you do talk about that a lot throughout the book, this paradox and this ambivalence. And I'm wondering how much of that was internalized in the people, or was it a literal divide where there were people who hewed to those old-fashioned values, believed very strongly in them, and then there were people who wanted to be modern? Or was it more of a struggle within individual people, this push and pull between that old-fashionedness and that sense of community in the church and modernity?
I think you put that brilliantly, John. I think it's absolutely much more that this divide is internal. I mean, obviously, there were dissidents. There were people who were standing out against it. Mostly, they were the writers. They were the artists. It's a strange society whose artists were almost completely at odds with the values of the society. And were often therefore, of course, very marginalized, very censored. A lot of them left. But the real struggle, as you say, was going on within most Irish people, most Irish Catholics, who felt on the one side, I mean, very deeply attached to this idea that Ireland was not just a Catholic country, but in some ways the most Catholic country in the world. This was very powerful for historical reasons, of course, because Catholicism was the form that Irish nationality took historically, right? Because Britain was Protestant. Ireland was strange in European history in that, most of European history after the Reformation ended up with, after all those religious wars, saying, well, look, whatever the religion of the ruler is, tough, that's your religion. You don't get much of a choice about this. And Ireland was sort of was exceptional in that regard, which was that the majority of the population in Ireland had refused to go along with that and had refused to become Protestants and had remained Catholic through great suffering and very penalized for it. So this meant that there was a very powerful sense that actually, loyalty to the church wasn't just a religious identity, it was also a political identity. And that fusion really was very, very potent. And so on the one hand, I think, people did want to be as good Catholics as they possibly could be. There was an element of compensation in this too. I mean, if you were poor, and Irish people were very aware of the rest of the world, because of migration. I mean, they were getting letters home from America with photographs and people showing the car and showing the nice house and showing the lives that they were leading. So they were very aware that their material lives were more impoverished than other people. And there was a kind of compensation saying, "Oh yes, but our spiritual lives are much richer. We're holier. We're a kind of beacon to the world." Remember, at this time, John, it's very hard to get your head around, but I mean, Ireland was sending out vast numbers of missionaries to America, to England, but also, to the colonial and post-colonial world. I mean, to Africa, to Asia. So that missionary idea that we were a kind of beacon to the world, it actually meant a lot to people. It sort of worked. So that kind of compensation factor was very strong. But the other side of this was that, of course, what people actually wanted was to not be leading such repressed lives, to actually have these opportunities and to be modern, whatever that very capacious term might mean.
Right. And of course, you could go to New York or Boston, but let's talk about the material conditions in the country and how that changed over time. You write that at the end of World War II, this really surprised me, among other things in the book, that 2/3 of homes in Ireland didn't have electricity. And so how over time does that change in the ensuing decades? And how much do people embrace modernity and advancement within the borders of Ireland.
I remember, John, a few years ago, I was in Kenya, rural Kenya, and I'm watching people, the daily struggle to get clean water, hauling water for miles. And I sort of identified with it because I remembered as a child when we would visit our cousins down in rural Ireland, like walking 2 miles to get water. So it wasn't just even electricity. I'm just like, clean water. And so it was at that level a very undeveloped country. And this was, had begun to change. I mean, there were big electrification schemes. There was a certain amount of investment in these things. But compared to a lot of the rest of Western Europe, and certainly compared to the United States, it was very, very undeveloped in all those ways. And so the year I was born, 1958, is a sort of revolutionary year. I mean, not just because of my birth, but because, it was the time when the people who were still in power were essentially the revolutionary generation who had formed the state. And, the state had come into existence in 1922 as a result of the sort of struggles of the IRA and all that stuff. They were still in power, but few of them were beginning to say, this can't go on. So what they'd done was they'd kind of cut Ireland off from the world economy. They put up very high tariff barriers, sort of idealistically thinking we'll build our own economy, we'll do things for ourselves. That had failed really, really miserably. And so you had a few people at the top, and particularly one or two civil servants kind of saying, we have to change.
We're talking very broadly about the culture and history of the country, and that's certainly what you come away from the book understanding, but it's built from these blocks of more intimate and specific and often cultural moments. And you essentially go through year by year, both your life and the life of Ireland, and you choose these moments as lenses through which to show these bigger ideas. So for instance, you talk about a talk show host named Gay Byrne, who I was unaware of, but sounds, like your equivalent of some combination of Johnny Carson and David Letterman. And so when did you strike upon that structure for the book, and how did you go about choosing which things to alight upon in order to tell the larger story?
My life is far too boring to write a memoir, which is a real problem, actually, when you get to my age, and I also didn't think there was much room for another straightforward history of Irish modernity. There's some fantastic histories if you want to read them, about which will take you through the archives and all that stuff. But I did think there was something which hadn't been done really, which was to try to tell this remarkable story. And it is a great story, I think, to tell it as a story. I mean, just sort of narrate it as you would, as if it were fictional, even though it's all true. And what you would do if you were writing a novel is, you would try to find specific intimate detail and then, use that as a way to try to unfold the larger developments that are going on. So I kind of hit on this way of trying to use. I initially thought I was going to write quite a short book, which would be just these vignettes in a way, just kind of using these kind of short little things of fragments of memory or family history.
I'm holding the book in my hand.
Yeah, it's big. It's
not a small object.
It's not a small object, But then I thought actually there's a way of using those things to maybe try to tell what I think is in some ways a sort of an epic story, really. What I was trying to get at, in a sense, was historians know how things turn out, and they have the benefit of hindsight, and they can tell you, well, obviously this is where it was going to end up. But of course, that's not the way people live. When you're going through stuff, and particularly when you're a child and you're experiencing this as you're growing, you have no idea really where any of it's going to end up. And in the Irish case, it was never a clear trajectory. It's as I try to describe in the book, it's not like, oh, we start out poor and backward and look at us now, we're fantastic and we're globalized. It's a much more complex process of moving backwards and forwards, of progress followed by reaction, great moments of hope, which then become moments of crazy, self-indulgent arrogance, which leads to a fall. And then you have to pick yourself up again and keep going. So in a way, I was trying to exploit this thing which you have in a small society as a writer, which is that your own life, however ordinary it is going to intersect with the bigger questions. There's lots of bad things about growing up in a very small, intimate society, but there's lots of wonderful things too, particularly if you're trying to write, because you can locate yourself in relation to all of these larger developments.
Right. And yes, and you can capture the texture of the place more or less in a way that you might not in a place like the US, where you're growing up among so many different landscapes with so many different people. There's so much to talk about in this book, and unfortunately, we have limited time, but I would definitely recommend that you used the word capacious earlier, and the book certainly is that. It covers an awful lot of ground, and from your education at the hands of a group called the Christian Brothers with corporal punishment and very as a window onto the educational system in Ireland at the time, up through what you call the body wars of the 1980s and women going to Britain for abortions while Ireland kind of, kept its hands clean in its own mind. But take us up to more or less today or the last decade or two and where you think that push and pull is now and whether it's a bit more settled or whether there is that enduring sense of identity that's always at play.
I think one of the interesting things about the Irish story, and one of the things that I sort of found quite comforting in a way, there's a lot of dark stuff in the book, as you say, there's a lot of violence and repression and hypocrisy and abuse. But there's also, I think, this story of a people coming to terms with itself. One of the reasons why we're still dealing with the darkness is at least we're dealing with it. That there's a kind of confrontation with the past going on in Ireland, which I think is very healthy. It's not easy, but for a society that was so much shaped by what we chose not to know. My title is very much that kind of pun on, in Ireland, if something is fantastic, you say, oh, we don't know ourselves. It's so great. But I also want to use it for literally about all the stuff we chose not to know about what was going on. And the women and children who were very much the victims of that. But contemporary Ireland actually is dealing with an awful lot of that stuff. And I think one of the hopeful things about the Irish story is that it shows you that you can transform a nation. You can make it in many ways an awful lot better than it was. You can open it up to the world. You can develop much more complex, ambivalent, non-binary senses of who you are. And yet you can still feel very much attached to a place and an identity. Irish people are not less Irish now than they were when I was born. I would say they're probably even more so because they're telling the truth about themselves to themselves and to the world much more than they were 50, 60 years ago. And so the truth is complicated, but complicated isn't bad. Identity is not something that you lose by acknowledging that it might be ambivalent and that there might be all sorts of contradictions within it. That is our identity. It's probably everybody that's true of, but certainly it's true of Ireland.
Well, it's a story that is very particular to Ireland, a very unique story, I think, but also that manages to somehow seem like a microcosm of many things that have happened over the last 60 or 70 years. The book, again, is We Don't Know Ourselves, A Personal History of Modern Ireland by Fintan O'Toole. Fintan, thanks for taking the time to talk to me about it.
Thanks a million, John. That was lovely.
Julie Otsuka joins us now to talk about her new novel, her third. It's called The Swimmers. Julie, thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for having me, John.
I'll just quote very quickly from the book review's review of the novel by Rachel Kong before we get started. She said that in a time of monotony and chaos, when death is as concrete as it is unimaginable, The Swimmers is an exquisite companion. There is a lot of thoughts about death and mortality in the book, and it's a short-ish book, but it makes a lot of big moves. So let's just start by situating people at the beginning of the book. Where are we? You've made a choice to narrate in a very particular way as we open.
Right. We're in a swimming pool in an unnamed city somewhere in California. And the first two chapters are set in this pool, which is really a haven of sorts for the people in the neighborhood. And it's told in the first person plural. So there's no main character. It's told in the we, what I call the we voice. And the second half, there's a sudden shift. I don't know if I should go into that or not, or keep it a surprise.
We'll get there. In that first section, you're sort of introducing this group of people through that we voice. And it is, like you said, a haven or a refuge for them. They even refer to everyday life as the above ground. When they're in this pool, there's a sense of getting away from things and feeling a little more comfortable. There are things both serious and a bit comical about the way that they experience this pool or they go to it. What did you want to get across in that first section about these people? How much are we sympathizing with them? Are we considering them sort of like us, or are we having a few chuckles at their expense?
I think both, actually. They're a bit fanatic in their love of swimming and their devotion to place, this place being the pool. I think, though, as many of us are. I'm laughing as the narrator, I think more with them than at them.
They come from so many different walks of life and do so many different things for a living, and yet there's this commonality they have. Is that something that, not to make it autobiographical, but I assume that you either swim or used to swim and you have a sense of, you're very convincing about that feeling of almost freedom as you glide through the water. Is that something that you've experienced?
I grew up in Southern California, so I spent a lot of time at the beach in the summer. So I grew up swimming in the ocean. And then when I moved to New York, I started swimming at a local pool. And I'd never really done laps before in a chlorinated body of water. So it was a very different experience of swimming. But I was really fascinated by the community of people that formed there.
Was there a sense of community in the sense that you met some people who you maybe otherwise wouldn't have, and you had this one thing in common?
Yes, especially I would say in the women's locker room, a really nice group of people there. I'm still in touch with several of them, even though I no longer swim at that pool. And also in the book, I wanted the pool to be a very democratic space, although pools historically have not been. There have been groups that have been excluded. But in my pool, all are welcome.
It's your pool, your rules, so you can make it a more democratic one.
My pool on the
And then,
page.
and then after we get to know them, you mentioned this shift in the book, and what happens is we're taken into a different perspective, and one of the swimmers in particular, a woman named Alice, we're put into her mind for a bit, and then we're put into a situation that she's living through, and what's her story, and we don't really see her very much at the pool. How much do you hint at her presence in the early pages?
She's actually there from the very beginning. She's there at the end of the very first paragraph, but I did not want the reader to be too aware of her. I want her to be there very peripherally, just as one of many. I want the reader to realize as a story is going on that it is Alice's story, but I don't want that to be so apparent in the beginning. So I really wanted to paint the world that she had thrived in before she enters the second half of the book.
We should say the shift happens before we even shift to Alice's, not really her perspective. We'll talk about that choice as well. But there's this narrative that happens in the pool, which is that these cracks start to appear in the bottom of the pool, and people are worried about it. There are even some conspiracy theories about it. It seems to heal for a time, and they almost miss the cracks being there. And then eventually the pool is shut down because of these cracks in the pool. How much does that transition us into the next part of the book? And what does that represent to you, moving from that into Alice's world?
Well, to me, the appearance of the first crack represents the beginning of the end. And I think in my past two novels, too, I think I'm always setting up these worlds that end somewhat catastrophically. So it could also be a metaphor for the cracks that are beginning to appear in her memory as well. But it also could be anything, I think, the crack. But it's also just a real solid crack in the world, just a crack.
It's the thing that does actually literally close the pool. They have to shut
Correct.
it down. And so Alice is in, I guess, the early stages of dementia at first. And then we're taken with her to this place called Bella Vista, where we, again, don't really have the traditional narrative voice. We're addressed as you, meaning Alice. And it's almost as if she's being addressed by the institution or by the institution's staff. I have to say that even though there's obviously a grimness behind this, I found some of those moments very funny, because there's a sense that the institution has these somewhat arbitrary rules. They have semi tongue-in-cheek ways of describing certain things like medication or sleep medication that they can give you. How much of that is satire? How much of that was you wanting to have the profundity of death and mortality alongside the kind of everyday comical things that we go through as people?
I felt that I was pretty much describing the world as it is. I didn't really have to do much exaggeration. And at the same time, I'd never really taken the point of view of the oppressor. In my first two novels, I've always, told the story from the point of view of the victims. And it was actually great, gleeful fun to take on the voice of this somewhat malign home. So I had a good time with that. And I could see the humor and the, at times, very absurd rules that govern the place.
Yeah, there's something a little Kafkaesque about it too, I guess. There's a funny line where they say something like, despite what you may have heard, we're here to help you, or something like that. So speaking of its reputation. And then we're finally put into the perspective of Alice's daughter, who has obviously suffered through watching this happen to her mother and taking care of her mother. And so you have these, I suppose, 3 to 4 moves of perspective throughout the book. And I wonder when that came to you, whether that was the way that the story came to you or whether that was something you built as you went along and decided to switch those perspectives.
I'd sketched out just a few paragraphs of that first chapter, probably when I was halfway through writing my last novel, Buddha in the Attic. And then I wrote Diem Perditi, which is the third chapter, a few years after I'd sketched out those scenes. And so those were kind of the two pieces that I started with. And I think because Diem Perditi was told in the second person, that I wanted to go back to that voice at the very, very end. So I guess it was kind of an organic structure that just evolved as I continued writing the book. I didn't really sit down one day with an idea of how I would, put these two halves together. It seemed kind of absurd in the beginning to want to write about a swimming pool and then about dementia.
And I don't want to force any meaning on it that may not be there, but as a baseball fan, I know that there's a lot of metaphorical talk about the sport as a microcosm of life and habitual things. It is hard not to see the way that even after you read about Alice's section, the way that then looking back on the pool, you sort of see it as very much just the way that people get through life every day, whether it's occasionally gliding and having a nice time or sometimes running out of breath or sometimes, having to go home because you're not feeling well. And there's a sense in which the pool seems to represent, like you said, Alice, I forget how you put it, but somewhere she thrived. Was that intentional as a sort of microcosm of her previous life before the dementia?
Yes, I really saw the pool as being a stand-in for the world. It's a kind of a meta place that seemed to encapsulate quite nicely just a world that we could live in. And it was a place where she belonged and where she was recognized and known earlier when she was in her prime before she began to forget as well. So these people knew her and, had watched her over the years as she began to decline.
I've seen in some of the reviews, people can't help but bring up COVID as one possible metaphor for the crack in the pool. And I wonder if the timing of writing this novel, whether some of it was written after that time and whether that did influence you at all in terms of the things you were experiencing in your own life and socially in writing the book.
I wrote the crack chapter before the beginning of the pandemic, but I actually I wrote that last chapter though, during lockdown, during the first year of the pandemic. So maybe in retrospect, I think I probably looked at the crack a little bit differently, but it could be a metaphor for so many things, bad diagnosis, it really could be anything. But I like that it's also seen as perhaps being a metaphor for COVID.
It works well without having to be that. And I do think it can stand in for a lot of what any reader brings to it. So obviously on a macro scale, the book has these interesting switches and perspectives that you don't necessarily see all the time, which makes it feel like a very unique reading experience. But then on a more micro level, I note that people, when describing the book, I think accurately talk about a certain mode you have where you can be, I've heard it described as pointillist. Someone else said that there's this great sort of accumulation of detail that can become almost hypnotic, and then it moves toward this deeper moment that's almost like a landing spot after this state. And I wonder, that's obviously not the only style you work in, but that is, I think, a part of it. And whether that's something you've always been interested in doing or whether there were influences on that, something that clicked for you earlier on in your career that made you enjoy writing that way?
I think that's just how my brain processes the world. Seriously, I think when my training is in painting and sculpture. That's, what I studied in college and I painted all throughout my 20s before I began to write. So I think I'm very obsessed with the detail. And so that's just how I begin in anything. I'll just take a lot of notes, just, about factoids, just gather data. At a certain point, pieces begin to add up, but I don't necessarily see patterns right away. I have to accumulate a lot of tiny dots before I can begin to see the whole picture. I'm also obsessed with the sound, just the abstract sound of, of sentences and where the accents fall. And I'm not sure why that is, if I have just a metronome inside of me or what. When I was writing my last book, I would read sentences out loud, which I no longer do because it kind of just seems like a time waster, just a stand-in for work, but not actually work itself. But I can really hear the rhythm of the sentences in my head as I'm writing. So that's another thing that guides me as well, I think, is the visual. And then on top of that, of course, the plot or the story that I'm trying to tell.
And are you swimming much these days, or has COVID put a dent in that?
No, I stopped swimming a few years ago and I moved my workout to on land in the gym. But since the pandemic began. I haven't set foot in the gym. So I really miss it though, but I've just been really, I go for walks, long walks in the morning.
Has the gym inspired any fictional thoughts yet?
Not yet.
No pressure.
No, I'm thinking about actually something very, very different.
Okay. Well, we'll look forward to it, and hopefully we'll have you back when that next book comes out. The novel, again, is The Swimmers, and Julie Otsuka, thank you so much for being here to talk about it.
Thanks so much for having me, John. It was a pleasure.
Alexandra Alter joins me now to talk about news from the publishing industry, or in this case, news from the movie industry and the publishing industry. The Oscars are this Sunday night, and as always, there are several movies based on books. So what are some of those, Alexandra?
So, yeah, I thought we could switch it up and talk about movies today because, who has time to read? Also, the Oscars are soon, and 4 of the 10 Best Picture nominees are literary adaptations, which is pretty common. You often see Hollywood turning to books for material because obviously that's where many of the greatest stories are told. But I think it's an interesting mix this year. It's sort of a surprising group of adaptations, including a short story by Haruki Murakami, a very beloved classic sci-fi novel that's already been made into a movie and is being made again. And then
you can say it.
Dune. And then
it's a divisive one.
These other novels that I wasn't familiar with, a couple of them, but that came out, decades ago, including The Power of the Dog, a 1967 novel by Thomas Savage, which was directed by Jane Campion and is this anti-Western Western about 2 brothers who live on a ranch in Montana. She really fought for the rights to this novel, so I thought that was kind of interesting when directors get really passionate about the source material. And the other big one that's up for Best Picture is Nightmare Alley. Guillermo del Toro directed it, and it's based on the 1946 novel of the same name by William Lindsay Gresham. It was adapted into a movie shortly after it was published. That version came out in 1947. So this is a reboot of a reboot, just like Dune. So I think between us, John, we've seen some of these films. It's always interesting to me to see what gets preserved and what gets changed because, the directors often say they're obsessed with the source material. That was certainly the case with Dune.
I think you have to be obsessed with Dune in order to tackle it for the movies.
Exactly.
The other one that I don't think is nominated for Best Picture, The Lost Daughter, which is nominated in some other categories, including Best Adapted Screenplay, and that's a Elena Ferrante novel that Maggie Gyllenhaal adapted as her first directorial effort.
Yes, and that's one that I actually have seen, that in Dune. I thought she made some interesting choices, turning the characters into Americans. Made sense. Originally, they were Italian, this family that the English professor, who's the main character played by Olivia Colman, encounters on the beach, and it leads her to reflect on her own history with her own children. But one challenge, I think, that I was impressed by how well it was pulled off in the film is that Ferrante's original novella is in the first person, and so it's very, very internal. And most of the story takes place in the main character, Leda's mind. So Gyllenhaal, I think, wisely resisted the urge to do any voiceovers and externalized all of that through flashbacks. And one other thing I thought was interesting about this choice of adaptation is this novella came out in English in 2008, translated by Anne Goldstein, and it's not as famous as Ferrante's Neapolitan Quartet. But I think this movie kind of helped drive more readers to it and shed light on some of Ferrante's other works as well. So I think Maggie Gyllenhaal had originally wanted to option another book, but learned this one was available.
Let's see, what are the other? I haven't seen Dune.
I loved it. I thought it was visually extraordinary. I thought the way that Denis Villeneuve, who was obsessed with this 1965 sci-fi epic by Frank Herbert, he was very adamant about wanting to capture the essence of the book. And I vaguely remember as a child watching the David Lynch 1984 version. I remember the sandworms being really scary, and maybe Sting was in it. Is that true? But this one is fresh with me because I watched it recently. And one of the things he really teases out that I don't remember being captured in the 1980s version is all the religious elements of the book, which, you think about it as a sci-fi epic about politics, and there is this interesting drug trade happening, but it's very esoteric. And this spiritual framework that Herbert created is very prominent. And when Villeneuve talked about some of the changes that he made, he enhanced the female characters quite a bit, including the protagonist's mother, Lady Jessica. She becomes this incredibly powerful figure and an incredibly important one in a way that she wasn't in the original. There, he said, yes, I am making changes. And he actually described adapting as an act of vandalism, which I thought was rather self-aware, that he was taking some spray paint to this original, but the changes that he made were carefully thought out.
I love that line about vandalism. And I think A.O. Scott, the Times' film critic, has talked about, and I hope I'm not putting words in his mouth, but I think on this very podcast at one point, he talked about how the more loyal an adaptation is to the original text, the more inert it tends to be as a movie. And so you actually do have to take big liberties in order to make a great movie out of a book. My last question is, two movies that I did see, Nightmare Alley and The Power of the Dog, are, as you hinted up top, they're not the most obvious source material. A lot of times you get adaptations of fairly recent books like Atonement or Empire Falls and that kind of thing. But is there any idea of whether those books are in print at the moment, or do the movies coming out mean that they'll be back soon for people to read?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it is interesting to see these pretty well-established directors, Jane Campion, Guillermo del Toro, reaching back decades to look at source material. So The Power of the Dog by Thomas Savage was actually recently published in a new edition by Little Brown and Company. And it has an introduction by Annie Proulx. And I think this may be, I don't know if it helped to position it, but often when these movies come out, they'll do a new reprint of the book with the actor on the front instead of whatever illustration they originally had. So we've seen this happen with both The Power of the Dog and with Nightmare Alley, which there is a new movie tie-in edition is what they're called. So both of those are in print and available if people want to check them out.
And Drive My Car, which is a movie that's high on my list of things to see soon, is actually based on, like you suggested, a Murakami short story.
Yes, it's interesting because the director, Ryusuke Hamaguchi, said that he took the short story and also a few other short stories from the same collection and kind of drew on different elements. He was really taken with Drive My Car, which follows this theatrical director who is grieving the loss of his wife. And the director, Hamaguchi, of the film said that really resonated with him, these sort of themes of loss and reinvention are things that he's explored in his other movies. So the screenplay also draws on elements from Murakami's story Scheherazade and Kino, which are in the same collection, Men Without Women, that Drive My Car is in. One of the funny things Hamaguchi said in an interview, he talked about some of the changes that he made, which I thought it sounded kind of trivial, but when you think about the fact that most of the movie is set in a car, it actually is important. He said he decided to change the color of the car, which was originally a yellow Saab convertible, and he made it a red Saab and not a convertible for a very practical reason. He said you couldn't really record dialogue in a convertible. So. But that's high on my list of films to see too. It's gotten extraordinary reviews, and I love Murakami, so I'd be excited to see how that work was translated visually.
Well, maybe we should both try to get to it before the ceremony on Sunday night and share notes. Thanks for being here, Alexandra.
Thanks for having me.
My colleagues Dave Kim and Greg Coles join me now to talk about what we've been reading. Hi, guys.
Hi, John.
Hey, John.
Dave, I feel like it's been a while. What are you up to these days?
I am reading a short story collection from Ukraine, actually, called Lucky Breaks by Yevgenia Belarusets. It was first published in Ukraine in 2018, and they were written after the conflict with Russia first started in 2014, after the annexation of Crimea and the fighting in the Donbass with Russian-backed separatists. So the world kind of forgot about this after a while, and this is where Belarusets picks up to highlight overlooked lives who've been transformed by the war. And they're not war stories per se. The characters are poor women, many of them displaced by the conflicts and settling down in Kyiv. And on the surface, they're about the everyday, the mundane, people looking for work, going to the beauty salon, having brief encounters. And I'm a little ashamed to say that I didn't find them all that interesting when I first looked at an advanced copy back in January. They were interesting in a kind of like Amy Hempel way, maybe Lydia Davis, in that general universe of short, offbeat stories. But I found them kind of slight at first. And of course, this war happens, and then I pick it up again, and of course they come just roaring to life. Suddenly the place names are familiar. The subtext is like this glaring headlight, and these characters, they're florists, manicurists, store clerks. They're carrying this just invisible, unspoken trauma that was just really powerful. It's such a Johnny come lately reaction. It only took a war for me to finally get it. But I think the power of this collection is not in its sense of immediacy or an on the ground battle reporting. These are stories just about people moving on and feeling a sense of meaning again after so much loss. It's a little bit surreal to be reading them as the war continues, because it's like looking into the future and seeing what this conflict will do to survivors who have to rebuild the country. But I'm really enjoying it.
Is there a lingering sense of fear in their lives, in the sense that they don't know what might be coming next, or they fear that something else might happen?
There is a little bit of fear, but I think it's more of just this emptiness, like a powerful vacancy that is just like come into their lives, and they're just sort of grinding their way through the daily absurdities of everyday life while they just had to deal with these horrors.
Is there a dark humor? You mentioned Lydia Davis and Amy Hempel.
There is a lot of humor in it, or I guess an understated humor. One of my favorites is called A Woman at the Cosmetologist's. And it's about the absurdity of this ritual of grooming and beautification. I mean, it's just, if you think about it, it's a little bit ridiculous, but it's also a salve for like a much greater inner turmoil. The customers go in and say, my face feels bloated, or can you help me with these wrinkles? But really the cosmetologist understands that there's just crippling heartache or unspeakable sadness behind it. So it's like this pageantry of healing. It's very coded, and you submit yourself to these kind of violent procedures, and then you walk out feeling just a little bit better. I'll read a quote, just a sentence. Beauty salons are, in their own way, war trenches and dugouts. Hungry soldiers hide in them, smeared with creams, injured by injections, ready to endure anything for the sake of anything. Yeah, just great stuff. Beautiful, subtle, understated collection.
Greg, are you reading anything nearly so timely?
I'm not. In fact, I'm casting about a little bit to figure out what my next book will be. I'm in the very early stages of reading Willa Cather for the first time, my Antonia, and I've never read any Willa Cather before, and this might be the next book. But the reason I'm casting about is that I've finally finished a book I talked about, I think, a couple months ago on the podcast, which is the 900-page 2666 by Roberto Bolaño. I promised, or threatened maybe, to return to that book once I was done with it, to talk about the femicide section, which is the fourth of 5 sections of that book. It's the section that I think got the most attention when the book was published and that made the book famous. So now that I've read the book, I can finally talk about the femicide section. It's funny. It's worth making the book famous. It is certainly the most memorable part of the book, but it's also very different from the rest of the book in tone, in structure. It's 300 pages itself. It's an entire novel-sized section on its own, and it feels slipped into what's otherwise a very different novel. Bolaño's an interesting writer because it feels like he's proceeding by intuition or improvisation. He just kind of swings from one vine to the next, taking you through this narrative. And so there's something very jazz-like about it, he's like the beat writers. You feel like he's making it up as he goes along. And then you look back and you see this kind of overarching structure that's in fact there. And I'm tempted to just dive right back in and read this book again with the hindsight of knowing how it's all assembled, whether he was operating with kind of a novelistic architecture or only intuitively and pulling all of this together. It's just a masterwork. The femicide section is set in a town that he calls Santa Teresa. It's clearly modeled on Ciudad Juarez, where in fact the real life femicides were happening and maybe still are on the Mexican-US border. And more than anything, what that section reminded me of at times was the New York Times' own Portraits of Grief series that ran after 9/11, because there are these little capsule moments, very kind of stark, journalistic, humanizing portraits of victims of these femicides that build and build and build. It becomes too much to bear, really. It becomes kind of numbing. It wears you down. And he never lets up. He never stops bringing you the human lives of these victims. You get glimpses of what they're reading, if they're students, what they're studying, just very mundane human lives cut short violently, not always by murder. He includes suicide victims in there. So it just builds this kind of rolling tidal wave of female death, but he implies that they're all related. And in fact, that there may be a serial killer responsible for most of them. And so it has this kind of noirish criminal procedural sense. You get the police detective investigating, you get the American journalist who came down to Mexico to cover a boxing match and instead gets sucked into the story of the femicides. But because they're so stark and so short and so relentless, you want to back up. You start to get worn down by them and think, all right, let's move on. And I think Portraits of Grief had that same effect unintentionally, where I think that Bolaño maybe intends it. There's kind of a commentary on our inability to bear this kind of grief at any sustained level. It's an interesting choice where it comes in the book, and because of the difference of tone and the difference of structure, it almost makes the rest of the book, which I talked about on the podcast with the critics looking for this kind of lost secret novelist with a pseudonym, feel a little bit frivolous because the stakes are so much lower. But I think part of Bolaño's purpose in it is that, in fact, these women had very low stakes lives until they were killed, and life and death is the stakes for all of us. So I talked about appreciating the critics. They're very passionate about a comically obscure writer, and you think, wow, the stakes are so low. But their passion, Bolaño holds it up as a subject of admiration, and you think, okay, he's doing something here, saying these are the stakes for all of us. We're all going to die, maybe not violently at the hands of a cartel or a serial killer, but we need to pick the thing that we're passionate about, that we're going to pursue. It's not as didactic as that either. I don't mean to say that he's hitting you over the head with a message. He really just kind of feels his way through this incredibly complicated. This book, I can't recommend it enough. I'm not the first to do that, and it feels a little bit funny. John, you asked if I'm reading anything timely or topical. I'm not. This is a book that came out years ago and got a lot of attention at the time, is rightly hailed as a masterpiece, and yet I feel like not enough people have read, or not a lot of people have read it. And so I want to impress on the audience, read this book. Read Bolaño.
I like that. It is the kind of book that, even though it got a lot of attention, I'm sure that a lot of people stuck a pin in it because of its size, and they said, I'll get to that one day. So listen to Greg, everybody. I need to listen to you too. It's one that I haven't gotten to, but that I mean.
What are you reading, John?
I just finished recently a short novel called Mrs. Palfrey at the Claremont by Elizabeth Taylor. And we ran a wonderful review of this book by Jeff Dyer in the book review. And I would point people there if they want to get a bigger sense of both Taylor and her career and the book, because I think Dyer says something like she became well known for not being as well known as she should be. Obviously, the name alone, she was an English novelist, and with the name Elizabeth Taylor, she was destined to be the second most famous Elizabeth Taylor, even if she were very, very famous. Which she's not really, but she should be. She's a fantastic writer. This is the second book of hers I've read. The New York Review Books Classics line has a bunch of them. This is the one they published most recently. And this was one of her more famous novels. I believe it was turned into a film. And it is a slender book, like I said, about a woman who moves into a residential hotel after she's recently widowed. And there's a kind of classic, wry, but touching group of people who are obviously at a later stage in life, but most of them, they're not yet in assisted living. It's kind of a way station between, full independence and the peak of life and whatever comes next. And so you get the relationships between her and these other people. One of the men essentially falls for her in a way that she is flattered by but doesn't return. they're always reading the paper and they have their little gripes about the larger world. And it's a book that when you describe what happens in it sounds very minor, but because Taylor is so talented, there's a larger sense of humanity in it and a lot of deep feeling about what it means to approach the end of one's life, which obviously makes it sound grim. It's not. It's not quite comic either, but it's somewhere in between. It's kind of a sweet spot that I like, actually.
It's a sweet spot that seems very British in the telling.
It's very British, and it's just, not just in tone, but in its details, which I trust Dyer about. He says something about how if you're not steeped in the class consciousness, how does he put it here? He says William Maxwell, I guess, had published Taylor's short stories in the New Yorker, so that was obviously great for her. But he said it's to Maxwell's credit that these stories, with their nuances of language and class, are usually muffled to anyone not steeped in the class consciousness of the host nation. And so Dyer makes his review an excuse to tell people to read Taylor more broadly, which I think is also true. My sense, having only read one other book of hers called Angel, is that this one is a little bit maybe more mainstream and easy to read in its pleasures, but I think everything she wrote is probably worth picking up. So I think her real name was Betty Coles, and she chose, as Dyer says, to have Elizabeth Taylor as a pen name. Chose to use her married name as her pen name.
She was married to a guy named Taylor, and Betty, of course, is short for Elizabeth. It was her choice not to go as like Elizabeth C. Taylor. It was just something to distinguish her. Maybe she thought she would be the most famous Elizabeth Taylor.
Hey, listen, aim high. I mean, she was a very talented person. So let's make her more famous. Guys, let's run down what we read again. Dave?
I'm reading Lucky Breaks by Yevgenia Belarusits, and it was translated by Eugene Ostashevsky.
I read 2666 by Roberto Bolaño.
And I read Mrs. Palfrey at the Claremont by Elizabeth Taylor. Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm John Williams.